Okay, so after a little gap, it's time to look at the heavy infantry, and the heavy infantry has changed quite a lot in Reforged from vanilla. It's probably the type of unit I would say that has changed the most, because while cavalry, in terms of its effectiveness, has increased in leaps and bounds since vanilla 3rd Age, their purpose has not changed, whereas heavy infantry's has, really. Heavy infantry was always the jack of all trades in vanilla, and well, in my personal opinion, it was the strongest unit type in vanilla simply because of how versatile it was and how relatively weak certain other types of units were in comparison to it. But now heavy infantry has changed somewhat in the sense that it is now no longer an all-round unit, at least as a general rule. There are some units which can be used equally for offensive and defensive work, but I'll get onto a little bit more of that in a moment. Really, heavy infantry is now based around defense. Their shields, generally speaking, they do less damage than shock infantry. They do, well, obviously less off a charge as well, at least for the most part. And heavy infantry is now much better off in formation. So shield wall is a very important thing now. They'll last a long time holding a line. Even against something like pikes, they won't get a lot of damage done, but neither will they fall quickly either. This does bring me on to, however, a handful of units which I've decided to omit from this list in a similar fashion to how I omitted the Elder Palace Guard from the shock infantry list, because there are certain aspects to them that I feel they're good units, but they won't be represented well enough on this list. They're sort of a more varied unit, and those 3 units are the Dwarf Nobleman, the Nazkai Bodyguard, and the Trollmen of Harad. Those 3 units will be essentially on a different list of, I don't know what I'd call it, wildcard units, I suppose, where they have more than one purpose and they don't really fit in anywhere. The Dwarf Noblemen kind of do fit into this list, but they don't have shield wall, which makes them more of an offensive unit than you might expect, because if they don't have shield wall, there isn't really a lot of point in picking them over several other dwarf units as it stands, at least not if you want to use them for defensive purposes, which is why I decided to move them onto a different list so we could talk about them and what they can be used for there. So here, the Trollmen of Harad, obviously they're more of an offensive unit, but they do also have shields and they are very tough. And it's a similar story with the Nazkai Bodyguard. The Nazkai Bodyguard could well be the best shielded infantry unit in the game, but they aren't really what you would call a defensive unit. Again, they're very similar to a shock unit in how they would be used, so it's kind of an interesting one, and it's why I decided to leave those 3 out, because I feel like more would be gained by talking about them as individual units rather than as part of this category, where all of the other units that are on this list are relatively similar in how they get things done. So we'll start off at number 10 and we'll carry on from there. So, number 10, we have the Castamir's Chosen, and one thing that I have noticed is Castamir tends to have higher standards than Khamûl according to the stats of their equivalent units. The Castamir's Chosen are quite fortunate to be on this list regardless though, because it was really as a result of the decision of me deciding to omit the Dwarf Nobleman from this list and moving them onto another one that they got onto it, because their stats are a little bit lower than most of the others on this list, but they are still a very, very good heavy infantry unit with 20 attack, 44 defense and 10 charge, 3 hit points, and every unit on this list has got 3 hit points, so they're all very tough, especially when you get them into shield wall. They're good in deserts, excellent morale, armor and stamina, so again they have all of the right things to last a very long time in melee, and that's really what heavy infantry should be all about. Now obviously against shock infantry most of these units will trade very, very inefficiently, well not very, very inefficiently, but not as well as they would. Obviously against top tier shock units like the Temple Inquisitors they all will. The Castamir's Chosen though, Umbar as a faction in general have got very, very strong infantry corps, perhaps slightly stronger in terms of shock units overall with their Abrazanim, the Corsair Fencers, and then of course the Harbingers of Castamir. But as a more defensive option these guys certainly aren't bad at all. They offer a very strong core. Other than that though, there's nothing really too special. The Good in Deserts trait is an interesting one, but it doesn't come into effect all that often. Excellent morale, armor and stamina is very important. Obviously it means they will last a long, long time. However, they do lose out in terms of stamina and mostly in terms of numbers to the units that are directly ahead of them. But, the amount of men they have in the unit, 102 on, I think this is huge scaling that I'm on at the moment, so that's kind of middle of the road. There are several units that have less, but there are some units that also have more, so they are at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of stats and numbers when you compare them to the other kingdoms of men. The unit that's ahead of them though is a little different. They have a slightly smaller unit, but they make up for it in other ways. Before Reforged, long were Rohan without a good standard heavy infantry unit, but now those days are thankfully gone, and the Helm hammers step into the breach now. Their stats are rather interesting. They have 30 attack, 49 defense, and 10 charge. They also have 3 hit points. They inspire, they're good versus armor, and they have excellent morale, stamina, and armor. All of those are very, very good things, and being good versus armor is significant. It means they do have a decent amount of bite on the attack as well as on the defense. Obviously, still a primarily defensive unit with those tower shields, but being good versus armor is a very, very good thing. And really, the thing that prevents them from getting higher on this list is the amount of men they have in the unit. 83 without the general on huge scaling means they do have a bit of a disadvantage next to the other kingdoms of men and their best heavy infantry units. Now, the trade-off is, of course, those don't have armor piercing, whereas the Helm hammers do. The problem is when you compare them to similar units of this type, where the unit is slightly smaller, but they have armor piercing weapons, that generally puts them up against the dwarves and the high elves. And those units are higher quality than the Helm hammers, so they do lose out in terms of that, but they are still a very, very good unit. You know, they're gonna last a long time. Even against heavily armored units, they'll do a decent amount of damage, but again, it's really their ability to, you know, they're not going to be able to sustain many casualties before the effectiveness starts to leave them, particularly if they get outflanked. But that's largely true for every unit, but in this case it's particularly poignant because they don't really have the super quality that some of the dwarf and elf units have to really back that up. But nonetheless, still a very good unit, still a massive boon for Rohan to have this unit. They are a very strong faction now, of course, and this really is what they will be relying on in a defensive siege, because you know, this and the Dismounted Royal Guard are defensive units that will last a long time, where in the past Rohan struggled in that situation. But there are other kingdoms of men heavy infantry units that are better than them, I believe, so let's move on to them, shall we? And so we have the Talon Knights from Dol Amroth, and they have 25 attack, 47 defense, and 15 charge, 3 hit points. They inspire, they cause fear, and they have excellent morale, stamina, and armor. And really, you know, in terms of why they're ahead of the Helm hammers, it can really just be said that their unit is bigger, and therefore tends to last longer in terms of defense than the Helm hammers do, and that is all important. As an offensive unit, the Helm hammers are better, but as I've said before, the heavy infantry is now a primarily defensive unit to use, and the Talon Knights are a very good unit for that. Dol Amroth in general have got a slightly offensive tint to their army, I would say, in the sense that even Talon Knights, they have a slightly higher charge than is customary for a lot of these kingdoms of men heavy infantry units. But even so, the Talon Knights' primary duty will be defensively, and really, Dol Amroth are a very quality-focused faction, and the Talon Knights getting onto this list isn't too surprising. Between these guys and the Haven Guard, the Dol Amroth Principality certainly has a very nasty infantry corps. Really, the thing that prevents them from getting any higher is just a matter of stats, really. The Kingdoms of Men units are all very similar, except for the Helm hammers with their slightly smaller yet armor-piercing contingent of units, and the Talon Knights really just lack a little bit of stats to make them go a little higher. They are nonetheless a very good unit though, and of course Dol Amroth, there's something about it. I mean, I can imagine some people not liking the Helms, but I certainly do. I mean, you know, very one of the kings of style, I would say, Dol Amroth, and these dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan, as they are, you know, a very nice looking unit, but also very effective. It's very small differences as well, which made them lose out on a higher place, so we'll move on to the next unit and we'll see why. The Witchround Blackguard are the only evil faction unit that makes it on the list. Now the Nazkai Bodyguard would have been on here if not for the fact that I decided it would be better for them to get their own space because of how good they actually are. But for the purposes of this, the Blackguard are the only ones that make it. It tells you something about how the evil factions, well at least the Orc factions, I say, not the evil factions because the Castamir's Chosen are there, but the Orc factions generally are a very aggressive force. Even Gundabad, which is focused a little bit more around their heavily armoured, more quality-focused units, are more offensive with the likes of their Hammer Guard. But the Blackguard are also a very, very strong unit to use on the defence. They have 25 attack, 48 defence and 20 charge, and they have 3 hit points, so again, Very similar to the Talon Knights, only slightly better in terms of stats, and they're also good in the snow. They cause fear, excellent morale, armor and stamina, and that's really the difference between them and the Talon Knights. They have very slightly better stats, and also they're good in the snow, if that should ever crop up. It is an interesting point about how they actually fit into a Gundabad army, though. I mean, on the defense, you will obviously be using this probably as your general's bodyguard, as the very last line of defense. But in a field battle, you're probably going to be using more aggressive units as Gundabad. The Hammer Guard, even something like the Witch Realm Inquisitors on horseback, maybe some of the Trolls. But even so, it gives you a more defensive option, which, of all of the Orc factions, I would say Gundabad are the ones which can make a defensive playstyle work best in an open field. Isengard are also pretty good at that, but I think that Gundabad have the overall quality, at least the defensive quality, to back that up, whereas Isengard, all of their high-end quality tends to be with their attack-focused units, whereas Gundabad spread it out a little bit. And the Blackguard are a very good unit. I also like the way they look. Nice shields, nice swords, nice helms as well. The helmet actually reminds me of something, but I can't quite place what it is. Nonetheless, the Blackguard are the only Orc faction unit that makes it on, and now we shall return to the Kingdoms of Men. I am glad that I waited for the mini-patch to come out before doing the heavy infantry list, because the Wardens of the White Tower had been left behind somewhat in the initial release of 0.9, in the sense that, despite Gondor having a good shielded infantry contingent, this unit in particular seemed to be rather lackluster next to the units that it was supposed to be fighting on the same level as. Now though, that is different. They have 30 attack, 49 defense, 8 charge and 3 hit points. They inspire, excellent stamina, morale and armor. And really, they may not cause fear like the Talon Knights or the Witch Realm Blackguard, but they do have a higher base attack and a slightly higher defense, so that's what makes them better in my opinion. A very good looking unit as well. I mean, Gondor always have had a certain something about them, and then obviously the movies has defined their style somewhat, but I do enjoy the Gondorian style. And this is a very important unit for Gondor because they are a primarily defensive faction, it must be said. They rely on their shields, they rely on their heavy armor. They are the most dwarven of the human kingdoms, it must be said, in terms of how they play. And the Wardens of the White Tower are their strongest heavy infantry unit. You could argue that maybe Gondor lack the mass overall that makes the dwarves so good. But this is a unit you certainly can't accuse of being bad. The Wardens of the White Tower will hold for a very long time, and they are a good complement, I suppose, that you can put alongside something like the Fountain Guard, or even something like just the Guards of Osgiliath. If you have like pikes and polearms and you back it up with something as survivable as this, it's a very difficult thing for something to just smash through, and that's generally what the Orcs are going to want to try and do to you, particularly if you're on a defensive siege. Definitely a unit I would now recommend. In the previous version of 0.9 I wouldn't have. I would have said they were pretty much a waste, but now I would say they're very much worth their cost. They are not the best human heavy infantry unit though. That honour belongs to another, and it's to an old friend. Despite all of these new units that have come in Reforged, still the strongest human, maybe it's unfair to call them human because they are dunedain after all, are the dismounted dunedain knights. And again, they follow the same pattern. They have 25 attack, 50 defense and 15 charge, 3 hit points, excellent morale, armor and stamina. What makes them better than the Wardens of the White Tower, in my opinion, is just the fact that they're slightly better in terms of defense. The defense is more important than the attack. The Wardens of the White Tower, you could say, maybe are better, but really I think that the 5 points in attack is not as important as the 1 point in defense because of how heavy infantry tends to be used. It is a primarily defensive unit. You want them to last a long time in melee, and it's something that the Dunedain Knights still just seems so adept at. The Wardens of the White Tower did come very close, and I was considering putting them above the dismounted Dunedain Knights, but I feel like overall these guys still have the slight edge, and also it may not make a huge difference, but there is one more man in this unit as opposed to the Wardens of the White Tower, so again it's a rather interesting little battle that these two units have going on. They are certainly the two best Kingdoms of Men heavy infantry units, and I decided to give it to the dismounted Dunedain Knights. Despite my love for Gondor, I had to follow what I think makes a good heavy infantry unit, and that is defense. Now though, we shall move on to an elf unit, the only elf unit actually that's on this list. The best of the OG units really have decided to dig their heels in and refuse to be expelled from the list entirely. Here we have the Smiths of Eregion, the best of the High Elven heavy infantry units. 44 attack, 62 defense and 20 charge and 3 hit points, good versus armor, excellent stamina, morale and armor. Essentially this is just a much better version of the Helm hammers, really. They have a couple less men in the unit, yes, but the really important thing to note here is they have a much higher base attack, a much higher base defense. The higher base charge is not really all that important, they are still a primarily defensive unit, but really it's the quality of the individual troops that is starting to shine through here. If you put these guys in a choke point, they are going to be a nightmare to dislodge unless you use crossbows or try and snipe them with artillery or something like that, because these guys will mulch through fodder and armoured units alike for a long, long time. As we saw, they're not quite enough to beat back the orc fodder hordes like certain other units will be, but you know, they are still a very, very good unit if you use them for their intended purpose. The High Elves do rely on their quality, of course. They are a difficult faction to play still, but I feel like now with the latest additions and the latest tweaks to the game balance, they are now certainly a viable faction to play, particularly if you adopt a defensive stance, and a defensive stance is what suits this unit in particular very, very well. 62 defense is very, very significant. They are not as good, however, as 3 units that are ahead of them, and I think you know the 3 units that are coming. More units from vanilla, and here we have the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin, and they have 45 attack, 60 defense, and 20 charge. They have 3 hit points, they are good versus armor, excellent morale, stamina, and armor. Essentially, these guys... There's something about these guys that I'm not sure how to place. There's something hidden going on with them, I think, because despite having comparable stats to the Smiths but having slightly less defense, they still managed to outperform them in most tests that I performed. I feel like mass is something to do with that. The dwarves are so difficult to dislodge when they're sort of in shield wall and they're all set up, but the Dragon Slayers are an interesting case where they're the most expensive infantry unit the dwarves can field, yet quite obviously they are not the best in my opinion, because you know very well that the 2 units to come are also dwarven. It's an interesting unit, this. There's something about them that I can't quite place. They are very good, but I'm not sure I would pick them over the 2 units that I have above them, particularly because these guys are more expensive. That's not to say they're bad, however. They will absolutely munch through the vast majority of units you put them in front of. They are also very good on the attack and on the defense, but primarily, again, defensive units. Very difficult to dislodge, obviously. The armor-piercing capabilities of these guys is extreme. They will be able to knock through armoured units very, very easily, so it's a bit of a conundrum if you go up against the dwarves that are on the defence. You need to find a way of dealing with units like this that isn't engaging them directly, because you're just playing into their hands. Ultimately, however, there are 2 dwarven units I think that are better, and again, in second we have yet another unit that is from vanilla. The old champion is finally deposed, and it felt like nothing would ever knock the guards of khazad-dum off the #1 spot, and for good reason, because they're still very, very strong. 44 defense, 44 attack and 68 defense, 20 charge, 3 hit points, good versus armor, excellent morale, stamina and armor. That dwarven mass is still present as well, 68 defense. I mean, 68 defense and 3 hit points is something that you're going to really, really struggle to get through. They are a very, very tough unit. And again, really the best thing you can do against them is try to engage them in a way that isn't just direct, because they will easily pay for themselves if you do that. Again, all dwarven units are not particularly fast, but in terms of being a defensive bulwark, they are just the kings of what they do. There are several dwarven units that are pretty damn good that didn't get on this list as well. Stuff like the Erebor infantry. Really the reason they didn't get on was because they only have 2 hit points, but even so, the dwarves as a siege battle faction are really, I think, the undisputed kings, particularly if on the defense. If you use a unit like this, you're going to have a lot of joy. They aren't the champions anymore though. They have finally been dethroned by a unit which I don't think is going to be going anywhere for the foreseeable future. I think they are intended to be the best heavy infantry unit that 3rd Age Reforged will throw up ever. So let's take a look at them, shall we? I think you know what it is. I'm not sure how many people will be surprised to see the Mithril Guard at #1. Probably not all that many. They have 48 attack, 71 defense and 20 charge. They have 3 hit points, they inspire, good versus armour and in the snow, excellent morale, armour and stamina. They can't hide, but let's be honest, the dwarves are never going to be an ambush heavy faction anyway, so there's no need for that really. And really it's only small margins that they are better than the guards of khazad-dum. They have slightly higher attack, slightly higher defense, they can also inspire and they're good in the snow. But nonetheless, these small margins, also they have 1 more man in the unit, so that's something. And these small margins are how the Mithril Guard depose the guards of khazad-dum from the number 1 spot. Of course they are slightly more expensive, but in terms of brute efficiency, the Mithril Guard have already proven themselves by very easily mulching their way through the orc fodder, with a good amount, over half their units still remaining. And to be honest, I don't think anything, maybe the Temple Inquisitors can challenge that with their high attack score, but I can't see any unit deposing the Mithril Guard from the top of that quality versus quantity thing that I've got going on. Really, it's the undisputed best heavy infantry unit. I would say that the Nazkai Bodyguard, potentially as a unit, could have something to say about that, but it's in a different way, which is why they're not on this list, and why I decided to talk about them as their own thing. But as an orthodox heavy infantry unit, the Mithril Guard are the undisputed best one, I believe. And the Dwarven domination is complete. They've locked down the podium places. The Dwarf Noblemen could have been on this list again, but I decided to talk about them in their own right. And this really is what the Dwarfs are all about, though. Heavy armour, heavy defence, so it's no surprise to see them so dominant. But still, 1, 2 and 3 all locked down is nonetheless very, very impressive. The Kingdoms of Men had a good showing as well. I would say that the evil factions, stuff like the Carmel's Chosen and, the Serpent Guard in particular, they're a different kind of unit now, the Serpent Guard to be fair though. The evil factions are about different things. The good factions tend to have a little bit more of a defensive edge to them. Really, Umbar are the one faction that you would see as a more, they have the most in common with the Kingdoms of Men, it must be said. Isengard as well, not too bad. But this is the heavy infantry, the Mithril Guard at number 1. I don't know what I'm going to do next. Perhaps crossbows, because they do have, there are a decent amount of crossbows now. It might even be enough for a top 10. I haven't actually counted them, but certainly there is a more comprehensive selection of crossbows now than there once was. But yes, I don't know what top 10 to do next. Someone did suggest doing the midline infantry, which is an intriguing idea, but it's also difficult to do because I would have to set some sort of limit on what that is, because for a start, with these units, they tend to get where they are based on how good they are as a single unit, but the midline infantry units, I would suggest that the cost and how many you can have and how they perform as a unit overall is probably more important than how they are individually. And also I would have to set a cost limit, obviously, because what is considered mid-tier for a dwarf is certainly not what you would consider mid-tier for an orc. So again, I'd be open to suggestions of how to do that. Again, I could do crossbows as well, or I could do mounted archers or spears or pikes even, but again, pikes is kind of an interesting one because there is one pike unit I would suggest is very, very good and the others are all kind of samey. But yes, I would be open to feedback on what one of these to do next. I'll probably do another quality versus quantity in the next couple of days. There was a bit of a lull in making videos. I did actually make one, but it was copyright claimed by Disney almost immediately as I posted it, so it was just a stupid little thing. But I do want to do more battles, but again, I haven't really had the time to do them recently. Hopefully I can do more of them, because I do like battles. Ultimately, playing the game is what we're all here for. But yes, I'd be open to suggestions of what to do next, and I hope to see you for whatever that is.